The bulldozer era, 2011 to 2016. If you were building a gaming PC during this generation, you'd literally be browsing forums where everyone, and I mean everyone, would tell you the same thing: just buy Intel. And you know what? They were right. AMD's CPUs were so far behind that recommending them felt like recommending a bicycle for a Formula 1 race. Sure, it technically had wheels, but here's the thing. While everyone was writing AMD's obituary, a small team of engineers was working on something in secret, something that would flip the entire CPU industry upside down. They called it Zen, and it would become the greatest comeback story in tech history. This is the story of how AMD went from just buy Intel to wait, should I buy AMD, to why would you buy anything else? Before we celebrate Ryzen's triumph, we need to understand just how bad things were, because you can't appreciate a comeback without knowing how far they fell. The AMD FX series, based on the bulldozer architecture, launched in 2011 with massive hype. AMD promised a revolutionary modular design with up to 8 cores. 8 cores when Intel's mainstream chips had 4. More cores means better, right? Wrong. So very wrong. See, Bulldozer's cores weren't really full cores. They shared resources in ways that made them weaker than Intel's cores. It was like saying you have 8 employees when really you have 4 employees sharing 4 desks. The math doesn't math. In single-threaded performance, which is what most games actually cared about, even Intel's Core i5 from 2011 was beating AMD's flagship 8-core FX 850, a $200 chip beating a $300 chip. Embarrassing doesn't begin to describe it, and it got worse. The FX 9590 in 2013 was so desperate for performance that AMD cranked it to 5 GHz out of the box, requiring a 220-watt TDP. This CPU needed a liquid cooler minimum. It was basically a space heater that occasionally computed things. PC building advice became a meme. AMD is for budget builds where you don't care about gaming. The brand that once competed with Intel was now a punchline. AMD's stock dropped to under $2 per share. Analysts were predicting bankruptcy. The company that invented x86-64 was about to disappear, but in October 2014, something changed. AMD got a new CEO, Dr. Lisa Su, and she had a plan. Lisa Su knew Bulldozer was a dead end. Instead of polishing a turd, she bet the company's future on a completely new architecture being developed by legendary CPU architect Jim Keller. Jim Keller had already saved AMD once before with the Athlon 64. Now he was building something new from scratch, something called Zen. The question was, could AMD actually pull it off? Ryzen 1000 series. March 2017. Have you ever watched a movie where the underdog finally lands their first real punch? That moment when the crowd goes silent and thinks, wait, is this actually happening? That was Ryzen. The Ryzen 7 1800X offered 8 cores and 16 threads for $499. Intel's comparable Core i7 6900K, over $1,000. AMD was offering the same core count for half the price. Intel forums went into meltdown. People who had just bought $1,000 Intel chips were watching AMD offer the same thing for half price. The word refund was trending in tech communities, but here's where we keep it real. First-gen Ryzen wasn't perfect. Gaming performance still trailed behind Intel's chips because Ryzen had higher memory latency and lower single-core clocks. The inter-core communication wasn't as tight. If all you did was game, Intel's Core i7 7700K was still the better choice at similar prices. Tech reviewers said Ryzen is great for productivity, but gamers should still consider Intel. But, and this is a massive but, Ryzen proved AMD could compete again. The Zen architecture was good, not just okay for AMD good, but genuinely competitive. The IPC was within striking distance of Intel. The Ryzen 5 1600 became a legend. 6 cores, 12 threads for $219. This chip offered i7 level multi-threaded performance at i5 prices. Budget builders suddenly had options. And AMD introduced something Intel never did, a socket that would last. AM4 would support 4 generations of Ryzen CPUs. You could buy a motherboard in 2017 and still use it in 2022. Intel users were buying new motherboards every generation like it was a subscription service. Intel responded by panicking. They rushed out Coffee Lake with 6 cores on the i7 after years of giving us 4 cores. Competition was forcing innovation. Gamers were winning. Ryzen 2000 series, April 2018. If Ryzen 1000 was the promising rookie, Ryzen 2000 was the sophomore who actually learned from their mistakes. Same fundamentals, but everything was just better. AMD moved from 14nm to 12nm manufacturing. Now 12nm was basically refined 14nm. Not a huge generational leap, but it allowed for higher clock speeds and better efficiency. The Ryzen 7 2700X hit 4.3 GHz boost, up from 4.0 GHz on the 1800X. More importantly, AMD fixed some of Ryzen's quirks. Memory latency improved, the chips ran cooler, the included Wraith coolers were actually good, RGB and capable of handling the CPU without sounding like a jet engine, the gaming gap shrunk, the 2700X was now within 10% of Intel's i7-8700K in most games instead of 15-20%. For streamers and content creators who gamed and ran OBS in a browser with 47 Chrome tabs, Ryzen was the obvious choice. The Ryzen 5 2600 became the new budget legend, replacing the 1600 as the go-to recommendation. It was like AMD had found the value sweet spot and just kept hitting it. Intel countered with the i9-9900K, 8 cores, 16 threads, 5 GHz boost. It was a monster for gaming. But it also cost $500 and ran hot enough to fry eggs. Intel was winning benchmarks but losing the value war. The conversation had shifted from just buy Intel to it depends on your use case. That might not sound revolutionary, but for AMD, it was everything. They were relevant again, but AMD wasn't done. They had an ace up their sleeve, a new manufacturing process that would change everything, 7 nanometers, and something called chiplets. Ryzen 3000 series, July 2019. This is where the story gets good. AMD moved to TSMC's 7nm process, a genuine generational leap. For context, Intel was still stuck on 14nm, having failed to move to 10nm for years. AMD had leapfrogged Intel's manufacturing. Let me say that again, AMD was now on a better process node than Intel, but the real innovation was chiplets. Instead of one big CPU die, AMD used multiple smaller chiplets connected together. The compute chiplets handled processing, while a separate I/O die handled memory and connectivity. Why does this matter? Manufacturing yields. Smaller chips are easier to make without defects. AMD could produce more working chips per wafer, reducing costs while scaling up core counts. It was like switching from making one giant pizza to making personal pizzas. Same amount of dough, way fewer disasters. The Ryzen 9 3900X offered 12 cores and 24 threads for $499. Intel's equivalent? Well, they didn't really have one in the mainstream. Their HEDT platform i9-920X cost over $1,000, and the 3900X wasn't just about core counts. IPC improved by 15%. Single-threaded performance was finally competitive with Intel in gaming. The gap that existed in Ryzen 1000 and 2000? Nearly gone. The Ryzen 5 3600 became the new gamer's choice. 6 cores, 12 threads, $199. It performed within 5% of Intel's gaming performance while costing significantly less. Tech reviewers started saying something they hadn't said in a decade. For gaming, AMD is a great choice. AMD even dropped a 16-core monster, the Ryzen 9 3950X. 16 cores on a mainstream platform. Intel had nothing that could touch it. Content creators, streamers, and developers were switching to Team Red in droves. Intel's response was confusing. They released the i9-10900K in 2020 with 10 cores, still on 14 nanometers, but they called it 14 nanometer plus because apparently adding plus signs makes it better. It was fast, but it was also hitting 90+ degrees Celsius under load and consuming over 250 watts. For the first time in over a decade, PC builders were actually defaulting to AMD recommendations. The tables had turned, but AMD wanted more. They didn't just want to compete with Intel, they wanted to beat them in gaming on Intel's home turf. Ryzen 5000 series, November 2020, the moment AMD completed their hostile takeover of the gaming CPU market. Lisa Su walked on stage and said something that made Intel executives choke on their coffee. The Ryzen 9 5900X is the world's best gaming CPU, and she wasn't lying. Zen 3's secret weapon was a redesigned cache architecture. AMD unified their L3 cache across all cores in a CCX, reducing latency dramatically. Games loved this. The 19% IPC improvement was one of the largest generational gains in CPU history. The Ryzen 5 5600X became the gamer's CPU. $299 for 6 cores that beat Intel's $500 i9-10900K in actual gaming. Let that sink in. A $299 chip beating a $500 chip in gaming. Intel's supposed strength. Every tech reviewer, every PC building guide, every forum recommendation flipped overnight. For gaming, get the 5600X. The 5800X is the sweet spot for gaming and streaming. The 5900X is overkill for gaming, but who cares? It's amazing. For the first time since the Athlon 64 era, we're talking 15 plus years, AMD had the fastest gaming CPU, period. End of discussion. Intel was in full crisis mode. Their 11th gen Rocket Lake was delayed, still on 14nm, and when it launched, it was worse than 10th gen in multi-threaded performance while barely catching up to AMD in gaming. It was like trying to win a race by running backwards. The only problem with Ryzen 5000? You couldn't buy it. Between COVID supply constraints and scalpers, CPUs were selling out instantly. The 5600X had a $299 MSRP but was selling for $400 plus on eBay. The silicon shortage hit everything. AMD also raised prices. The 5600X was $299 compared to the 3600's $199 launch price. Some saw it as AMD finally charging what their CPUs were worth. Others saw it as AMD becoming the very thing they swore to destroy. Still, Ryzen 5000 was AMD's coronation. The underdog was now the king. But every king eventually faces challengers. Ryzen 7000 series, September 2022. After 4 generations on AM4, AMD finally moved to a new socket, AM5. And unlike Intel's new socket every 2 years approach, AMD promised AM5 would last until at least 2027. Long-term thinking, something Intel seemed allergic to. The platform shift was painful though. AM5 required DDR5 memory, no DDR4 support, and in 2022, DDR5 was expensive. Early adopters were paying double for RAM compared to DDR4. A $300 CPU suddenly needed 200 plus in RAM instead of 80 bucks. The Ryzen 9 7950X was a beast, 16 cores, up to 5.7 GHz boost, and absolutely dominant in productivity workloads. Content creators, rendering enthusiasts, and professionals loved it, but there was a problem. Intel's 12th and 13th gen chips had clawed back gaming performance. The i9 13900K actually beat the 7950X in several games. AMD's gaming crown was slipping. AMD heard the criticism and adapted. They released the Ryzen 5 7600 at a lower price and even launched AM5 motherboards at lower price points. And then they did something clever. Ryzen 7000 X3D. The X3D chips added 3D V-cache, a massive stack of additional L3 cache literally built on top of the CPU die. More cache equals lower latency equals better gaming performance. The Ryzen 7 5800X3D had already proven this concept, dominating gaming benchmarks despite being last gen. The Ryzen 7 7800X3D launched in April 2023 and immediately became the best gaming CPU you could buy, period. 8 cores, 96 megabytes of L3 cache, and it demolished everything, including AMD's own more expensive chips in gaming. The 7800X3D was beating the $600 Ryzen 9 7950X3D in gaming, despite costing $449. It was beating the $600 i9 13900K. It was beating everything. Tech reviewers called it the only gaming CPU recommendation that matters. And the best part? It ran cool. While Intel's high-end chips were pulling 250 plus watts and hitting thermal limits, the 7800X3D sipped power at 120 watts while delivering better gaming performance, efficiency, and speed. AMD had cracked the code. Ryzen 9000 series, August 2024, the current generation. Zen 5 arrived with promises of another IPC improvement, up to 16% in some workloads. The Ryzen 9 950X and 9900X brought more traditional performance gains while everyone waited for what really mattered, the X3D variants. The 9800X3D launched and immediately claimed the gaming crown. Again, AMD's 3D V-cache strategy was proven. For gaming, cache is king. The 9800X3D offered around 8 to 10% better gaming performance than the already legendary 7800X3D. Intel, meanwhile, was dealing with issues. Their 13th and 14th gen chips had stability problems, degradation, crashes, a microcode bug that was literally killing CPUs over time. The internet was flooded with My Intel CPU died posts. Intel eventually acknowledged the issue and extended warranties, but the damage to their reputation was done. AMD, by contrast, had built built a reputation for reliability. Their CPUs just worked. For gamers in 2024, the recommendation is clear. If you want the best gaming CPU, buy AMD. The 9800X3D for top-tier gaming, or the value-oriented options in the 7000 or even 5000 series, which are still being sold and still excellent. The company that was told just buy Intel 7 years ago is now the default recommendation. That's not just a comeback, that's a complete market reversal. So where does Ryzen go from here? Zen 6 is on the horizon, promising further efficiency gains and potentially moving to 3nm or even 2nm manufacturing. The performance per watt improvements could be massive. AMD is also pushing APUs harder. Processors with integrated graphics good enough for real gaming. The Ryzen 8000G series already lets you play modern games without a dedicated GPU. Imagine future APUs that could handle 1080p high settings without a graphics card. AI features are coming to CPUs too. AMD's already adding NPUs, neural processing units, to their chips for local AI acceleration. Your CPU might soon be helping with AI upscaling, content creation, and who knows what else. Competition with Intel will continue, and that's good for everyone. Intel's Arrow Lake and future architectures will push AMD to keep innovating. The days of one company dominating unchallenged are hopefully over forever. From Bulldozer's disaster to Zen's miracle, from just buy Intel to just buy AMD, from near bankruptcy to market leadership, Ryzen's story is proof that companies can come back from the brink. It took brilliant engineering, smart leadership, and a willingness to bet everything on a new architecture. AMD didn't just improve Bulldozer, they threw it away and started fresh. Sometimes the best fix is starting over, and the ripple effects benefited everyone. Intel was forced to innovate. Prices came down, core counts went up. The CPU market today is better for consumers specifically because AMD refused to die. So which Ryzen generation changed your gaming experience? Were you a Ryzen 1000 early adopter who believed when nobody else did? A Ryzen 5000 convert who finally switched from Intel? Or are you rocking an X3D chip right now, living that high cash lifestyle? Drop your Ryzen story in the comments. I want to hear about the builds, the upgrades, and the moment you realized AMD had actually done it. And if this video gave you a new appreciation for the engineers who saved AMD and revolutionized the CPU market, share it with someone who still thinks Intel is always better. They've got some catching up to do. Thanks for watching Video Games Explainer. I'll see you in the next one.